All right, welcome everyone to the sixth session of Aveco Economic Forum, a student panel discussion. Today we have a very interesting topic, that is recession 2008 versus 2020. What was the main difference? What were the causes? What were the effects in the economy of world economy? Let us look into it. We have two very interesting panelists today. We have Mr. Varad Kulkarni here, who is pursuing a started accountancy, and he has been a part of many of the panels before. We also have with us today Miss Shreya Singh. She's from St. Xavier's College, Mumbai, and she's also an avid economic and finance reader. Yes, perfect. So let us start with our discussion today. The first question goes for you, Shreya. Just could you brief out the recession that is currently happening in 2020 and what was the main cause behind it? We do know it is the coronavirus. Could you just show how the world has responded to this pandemic?
So before I talk about the 2020 crisis, I'll just give a brief about what a recession is. Now, there's no official definition of what a recession is supposed to be. Rather, there exists a general recognition of what a recessionary environment is supposed to be like, and most associated with a period of economic decline. Now, economists have gone ahead and identified an indicator and specified a time period for us. Indicator is GDP. If it records a negative growth rate for two subsequent periods, quarters, so 3 months, 3 months, 6 months, and if your GDP records a negative growth rate, you have yourself a recession. Now, the 2020 crisis, the recession wasn't caused because of inherent fallacies within economic infrastructure. Yes, it exposed them, but wasn't a direct result of those inherent fallacies. Rather, as we all know, it was induced by the pandemic. And the main reason was you had to curb the spread of the virus. And to curb the spread of the virus, you had to step up your essential containment measures, which effectively led to a decline in the aggregate demand, which is known to be a key cause of causing a recession in most economies. And that is what we are facing right now during the 2020 crisis.
Absolutely, that is right. As the coronavirus spread across the countries, right? Every single country got affected. They took precautionary measures. So, I mean, was moment the main cause for the recession of 2020, or do you think there were smaller other factors contributing to the recession?
Yeah, I think why this recession stands out is because of our inefficacy to direct human and physical resources. It is different in that aspect because, as I said, you have to curb the spread of the virus, and that is why prioritizing essential containment measures becomes important. That is why even your monetary support, pumping the economy with liquidity, or even adequate fiscal stimulus weren't all that effective because you couldn't very well uh, encourage the consumers to go out and consume. So that was a key issue that most of our policymakers faced during this recession, and that is why it stands out. And yeah, the pandemic may not be the only one cause. It's also inherent fallacies in the economic structures that we have built up until now. They aren't all that sustainable.
That is absolutely right. Very well put, Shreya. Thank you so much. So, Varad, we are pretty fresh with the concept of the 2020 recession. We have the Great Recession of 2008, which has been the greatest that the world economy has yet seen. So, what was the contributing factors for the 2008 recession?
So 2008 recession and 2020 are probably one of the greatest recessions our world has witnessed over a period. 2008 recession was a little bit different from the 2020 in terms of the trade cycle aspect. 2008 recession was caused mainly due to fall in real estate prices in the United States, but the 2020, as we know, it is mostly caused due to the pandemic. In now, continuing with your question, 2008 recession was caused mainly due to fall in interest rates in the United States, as well as a falling stock market, which was a result of burst in IT stocks, which resulted after 2001. As we all know, after 1999, that there was a software boom, All the IT stocks were gaining their market capitalization to the next levels. After that, what happened over a period of next 6 to 7 years is that stock prices went on falling, interest rates went on decreasing over a period. As a result, the mentality of investor, which is generally to hedge, gain more returns out of any of the property, started to started to highlight basically. So what happened is that people turned their back at the stock market. They refrained from putting their money into banks, and finally they started looking at real estate as a masiha, a savior. And then United States has also the uh, inherent capacity to be one of the greatest investor friendly place in the world. Hence, the investors started feeling that even in the future, these prices will keep increasing. That's why the banks started giving the loans on the basis of collateral of real estate. When the software boom started recovering, the interest rates till 2007, December 2007, reached 5 to 6%, which was quite attractive as compared to the 2001 levels.
That is right.
The uh, prices of real estate started declining. The banks started feeling the crunch which they were facing between the loan sanctioned and the amount of collateral which is now realizable at the present. So it resulted in crunch on the side of banks, that they were not able to recover their amounts. The people who had CDS and CDOs in their hands, they started defaulting the bank loans, which resulted into a weaker banking system. And as we all know, when the banking system of the economy fails to operate effectively, the entire economy uh, starts to feel the heat. And
That is
for
right.
that matter, when the US economy starts feeling the heat, the world also somehow reacts. As we all know, when the US sneezes, the world catches cold. It is a very famous proverb by some of the economists.
Absolutely. Yes. That was very well put, Varad, and really detailedly explained to us. Thank you so much. Now let us go to a more technical aspects of the two recessions and let's compare and contrast the both of them. All right. So Shreya, the first question goes to you. In 2008, the USA and UK took the lead in managing the crisis as they were the financial giants. But in 2020, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson and President Donald Trump have had a bumbling response to COVID 19 with delayed actions, monetarily and socially. So, since both the countries have been a part of G7, how dependent is the global economy on them? And do you think the situation has worsened in 2020 case due to the negligence by them?
I think the adjective bumbling sums up USA's and UK's response this time around, especially USA. And as you said, in the past, we have seen USA leading the global war against economic crises and even epidemics and pandemics such as the Zika virus. You had Ebola, you had the HIV/AIDS campaign. This time around, it was more of shifting the blame, pointing fingers, making shallow threats of defunding the World Health Organization. And the effect was clear. The end result was that USA had a death toll that far exceeded that of China's. The unemployment claims filed in USA's are far higher than the ones filed during the 2008 crisis. I think, and it has to do a lot with the leadership of the time. And now, when we come at UK, we see that the delayed response in handling the crisis was not a result of a lackadaisical attitude towards the disease and the economic crisis looming ahead. Rather, it was a result of ineffective and ambitious policies. When who declared the COVID-19 disease as a pandemic, UK's first response was to go ahead and build a herd immunity among its citizens, which clearly backfired. And thus we saw a delayed response from UK. But at least on the economic front, this fiscal stimulus provided was adequate. They were successful in identifying the most vulnerable and also providing support to sustainable businesses. But then neither of the two economies were able to live up to the image of this global power that we have come to associate with the two of them. And now coming to the crux of the question, did the global economy suffer because of this? I would say not to the extent we would have expected it to. And I have two reasons to back this claim. First of all, we look at the trend prevailing in the latter part of the decade that just went by. And from 2016 onwards, you can see that deglobalization was increasingly becoming a trend. And this was largely because of apprehensions arising out of the US China trade war. And thus, we did not face that domino effect that we would have, as Varad so very eloquently stated in his part, that if US sneezes, the world catches cold. Yeah, so that did not happen this time around. And then you go ahead and look at countries region specific wise. You look at the Southeast Asian region, and you can see that most economies here received infrastructural aid from China to respond to the crisis. You had seen that China was providing mostly Southeast Asian countries with PPE kits. Even India was one of the beneficiaries. Then you move on to the Middle East region, and you see that countries here performed pretty well for themselves. They were able to keep their economy afloat for the worst of the crisis, and were also pretty successful on the social front. And then you move on to the Latin American and the Sub-Saharan region, where countries had already been receiving support from international organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, and this was only prolonged. So I would say that neither of the economies suffered that domino effect, despite US and UK largely failing to live up to their image of a global power.
That is right. Now you brought forward the point of international organizations such as IMF and WHO financially and voluntarily, helping out the less developed and developing economies. But do you think that the role that they play is not very much coordinated, like the role played by WHO, IMF, they look forward to their own benefits. Like, because it has been realized in this pandemic that these organizations were required to come together in partnership to help in global upliftment. There has been a blame game between the nations and the officials within these organizations. Do you think that is true? Do you think this comment makes sense?
To look at how reasonable the blame game is, we should first look at the responsibilities of these international organizations. That is largely to safeguard monetary stability and promote economic growth. They do this through surveillance, response, and revision. Now, the 2008 crisis is a different story altogether. We come to 2020 and we see that we can safely ignore IMF and World Bank's part in the surveillance and revision part of it. The crisis was caused because of an external factor. But at least in the policy response part of it, we saw that IMF and World Bank did not shy away from their responsibility. After the 2008 crisis, they had come to the center of the e-governance, somehow came at the forefront of economic governance, and their lending capacity, at least in the period of 2009 to 2011 itself, increased from some $1 billion to $220 billion. And this time around, it had a capacity of some $1 trillion lending capacity. And it did use that judiciously. It provided most economies with excessive lending support, also provided liquidity support to these economies, and loan waivers for economies, small market economies, which couldn't have repaid that loan or would have faced even worse budget deficit because of that, or a balance of payment crisis. So I would say that IMF and World Bank did not shy away from their responsibilities this time around either. And Even the surveillance part of it, World Economic Outlook of 2018 and 19, was increasingly wary of a global crisis, a global recession looming ahead of us in 2020. And they had adequately stepped up efforts to fight that crisis as it is. They just didn't anticipate it to be a crisis of this large a proportion. And if you look at the blame game and pointing fingers at one another, I think it's largely because of countries trying to evade their own responsibilities to fight the recession, as we can already see in USA's case. USA is a prime example, and the whole tiff with World Health Organization had more to do with the administration's ego over its policies rather than the responsibilities of these international organizations.
Absolutely. Very well put, Shreya. Thank you so much. Varad, I'll just expand this topic a little bit more to ask you a question. Now, as Shreya has mentioned, the role of World Bank, WHO, IMF, there is this missing organization of World Trade Organization, WTO,
Yeah.
has not gotten much into news during the pandemic. Now, we obviously know this organization has faced a lot of trouble, especially with the USA-China trade war since 2016. Right. So, how much important was the role of WTO during the pandemic? And do you think their role would have helped curb the recession? Did they actually play a major role during the pandemic? Because that was not heard in the media. So, what is
Yeah.
your response to it?
So, first of all, we have to understand the role of WTO. It is basically a worldwide regulator, a organization which is set up by mutual agreement between 195 member countries in the world.
Mhm.
So what happens is that World Trade Organization is nothing but a body which regulates the disputes which are occurring among all the countries. According to the agreement, World Trade Agreement, it is said that no country can impose excessive tariffs or selective tariffs or uh, embargoes on trade from a specific country or so. But as we have seen since 2016, the trade war has been looming over the countries. We have seen that even India, China have been on the continuous trade disputes, which are not acceptable as per World Trade Organization treaty. Further, I would like to add that the political game which was going in the international areas such as US has been continuously imposing sanctions on Iran, which is
Mhm.
which is an important economy in the Middle East. Political embargoes on many countries in Africa such as Libya, Algeria, South Sudan
Mhm.
have been increasing since predominantly since Donald Trump came into the power. So what happens in such recessionary situations is that countries try to blame game. That is the first part, to hide or evade, as Shreya said, the responsibility of the administration and to not bring it to the public notice. The same has been observed in 2020 also. The country started playing a blame game, and after that, the agreement of WTO started becoming weaker and weaker. And
Yes.
at a point, we can say that we could not believe that these international organizations such as WTO and World Health Organizations were there in place, because
Mhm.
the member countries were not only taking decisions in the harmony, the basic foundation on which these organizations are built up are becoming weaker. So that's why, if in recent times, if you remember, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been continuously emphasizing on increasing seats in the World Trade Organization, as well as, for that matter, the United Nations Security Council.
Mhm.
There also India has claimed that we need a seat to represent Asia, as well as in past 4 days itself, India has demanded to include a seat for African Union in
Mhm.
both World Trade Organization as well as Security Council.
That is right.
So this is the crux of the story that the member countries are not representative. They are being categorized on the basis of economic and political powers.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Responding to your question more appropriately, I would like to say that the response which was needed from WTO, that was to regulate the tariff barriers and embargoes which were being imposed throughout the pandemic on the countries.
Mm-hmm.
They could regulate that. They could remove some sanctions with mutual agreement with the United States on Iran and let's say some weaker countries in African Union as well,
Mm-hmm.
some trade relaxation, some MFNs in US economy, some uh, Federal Reserve Treasury bills were uh, could they could be allowed to the countries,
Absolutely.
weaker countries. Then we can say the WTO, although it is not part of WTO agreement to uh, ask any government or any multilateral organizations to provide bailout packages
Mm-hmm.
to any countries, but this could have been possible if the organizations would have approached the situation carefully.
That is right. Well,
Yeah.
talking about the kind of policies that economies in the world could make to fight the recessions in the countries. Now, of course, the pandemic has been presiding since March 2020, and since then, economists have had their own views. How the government could tackle the situation. But there's one thing that they could not predict was the extent to which the pandemic or the recession would take place, because there were often new cases arising. There were often some international disagreements taking place, and hence local countries had to change their own reforms, right? So comparing this to the 2008 recession, where the policymakers did have a good idea how to fight it out, what do you think the challenge was for the policymakers for every economy? We'll talk about the developed economies here, like USA and UK, and you could also bring in a few points of India's economics policies.
Yeah. So what happens is that during the 2008 crisis, the US Federal Reserve was very successful in tackling the situation. I won't say they were doing things perfectly, but at least they did the things at correct time and
Mhm.
they did it rightly. I will give you a few of the examples how to justify my reason as to why they did things correctly.
Mhm.
As soon as the recession hit the markets, the Federal Reserve brought in the regulations to regulate the circulation of CDOs and CDS, which are basically the derivative instruments which were the root reason
Mhm.
which caused the fall of Lehman Brothers, which was that time the fourth largest investment bank in the US. So I will just briefly call out what is CDO and CDS.
Mhm.
CDO is a derivative instrument which is purchased by investment banks from the lending banks
All right.
and which are sold further to the investor as just similar as FDs and other debt instruments which are already being traded in the market. So these are just similar investments which are to the investors, but the chairperson of Federal Reserve that time failed to brought in regulations, or he refrained from getting in the regulations to regulate CDOs.
Mhm.
But once the recession was hitting the economy, immediately the Federal Reserve come up with the idea to regulate this market also.
Mhm.
Next example is that when the AIG, which was providing insurance on the CDOs which are issued by investment banks,
Mhm.
immediately when AIG was collapsing, they had reported $99 billion of losses in that particular fiscal, which was huge, which was humongous for their organization as a whole, which was probably almost 164-year old organization at that time. So Federal Reserve bought in A Federal Reserve in association with US government brought in bailout packages for the uh, ailing companies,
All
and
right.
they were quite successful in that to protect the interest of common people in the society. In contrast of that, in 2020 we have seen that there were bailout packages, there were put some regulations uh, on the, we can say, the policy rates, but the response which was expected from the US government was not there. As if to justify my statement, I will just quickly add few statements more. We
Sure.
could expect more bailout packages for ailing US companies. Recently, we have seen a great US company operating in industrial alcohol and wood,
Mhm.
which filed bankruptcy. It had almost 25 to 30,000 employees which faced unemployment. It
Mhm.
had a great market capitalization also.
Right.
It failed, and this is just a one example. There were
Mhm.
so many like this. We did not see any bailout packages from the government. Further,
Mhm.
we did not see any economic stimulus. We have seen it, but the level which was the economy was expecting from
Mhm.
the US government, that we could not see uh, at
That
this
is
time.
right.
We can see that automatic stabilizers of the economy have become so strong over past 12 to 15 years that it
Mhm.
has helped the developed economies to recover by themselves
Right.
than any stimulus packages or bailout packages.
Mhm.
However, if they were introduced, the process could have been easier.
So, Shreya, the next question is towards you. So, as you had mentioned during introducing the recession of 2020 about deglobalization, right? During 2008, there was a march of globalization and multilateralism reigning in the majority of the countries. And since the 2008 crisis, it was cyclical and they did not change the path. However, the cry for 2020 economy has been deglobalization, which many policymakers have been wanting to have at least after the 2008 crisis. More dependency on local companies, more strengthening of the local economies. So, should this effect have taken place earlier, the call for deglobalization? Do you think it should have taken earlier so that we could fight the 2020 recession better?
Yes, you're correct in pointing out that the past decade, the trend was deglobalization, economic nationalism,
Mhm.
and populist policies were the buzzwords. Most of the governments came to power and even got re elected on the basis of these populist policies. So the citizens agreed with these policies, and you have clear examples. You have countries like Brazil, USA for that matter, even Pakistan to some extent. And governments here have been very strongly advocating for deglobalization and severing trade ties with various other countries.
Mhm.
Should this have come earlier? Well, nobody can judge that, but at least when it came starting from 2016 or even a little before that, it was instrumental in helping the global economy evade the hegemonical presence that USA had casted over the global economy. And in hindsight, that was beneficial because owing to the response that USA had to the current crisis. But I would never suggest that deglobalization, a prolonged retreat, would be beneficial. And I wouldn't say that it should have had come earlier after this conclusion, because most of the small emerging market economies, which are uh, which are lacking in natural resources,
Mhm.
progress made by these emerging economies would have been reversed owing to a prolonged retreat from globalization. One of the fundamental principles of economics is that everybody benefits from trade as long as it is fair. So I wouldn't say that prolonged retreat or an earlier retreat from globalization would have been beneficial for the global economic community at large.
All right, that's a fair response. Shreya, so I'll just take the focus of globalization towards Indian perspective here. All right. So, as you have known, China has been one of the most important trading partners for India in all these years. Recently, it has been USA in the last couple of years, which is the biggest trading partner. But still, India is pretty dependent on China, right? And even due to China, we also are not a part of RCEP deal. And during the pandemic, we have been having the anti-China slogans everywhere. We have been trying to get in Indian products, but since at least till 2020, the policy was China would not import from India, but India's import would be high. China had a lot of bilateral, what do you say, trade barriers kept in place, right? So, if India had sought after the RCEP deal at this time, where coordinating with the Southeast Asian countries, so do you think India would not have had a greater recession, at least because of the effect of China? Do you think India should have traded less with China, at least in the last 5-10 years?
I wouldn't say India would have should have traded less with China. I would take a little different route here, and I would say that India should have stepped up its trade ties with other Southeast Asian countries in the region, because we can isolate India's and China's trade deals, which is happening now. But India is again at a disadvantaged position because it does not have strong trade partners. It has also backed out from the RCEP deal. We can't fault anyone except the policymakers, because the domestic infrastructure in India itself wasn't all that strong to have challenged China's dominance if we would have been a part of a multilateral trade treaty. So we can ignore that as well. But it won't be wrong to say that up until the past 2-3 decades, India enjoyed a sort of traditional authority in the Southeast Asian region, which China has been usurping late as of lately. You see the CPEC corridor, the One Belt Road Initiative, the Trans-Himalayan Railway Roadways network with Nepal. So India is finding itself increasingly isolated, and all its neighboring countries are allying with China. Combine this with border tensions and India's trade war with China, which has taken up a different, an entirely different phase, at least in the pandemic. India is increasingly finding itself disadvantaged, at least in this time, when it comes to trade ties with China and various other allied partners and countries, at least in the Southeast Asian region. So what needs to be done is maintain a neutral stance with trade ties over China, and step up efforts to increase trade ties with other neighboring countries, and also increase connectivity with these countries, so as to put up an united front against China's hegemonical power that it is acquiring the recent times.
Absolutely. Really good examples brought forward, Shreya. Thank you so much. Varad, you had earlier mentioned, you had given the comment that when US sneezes, the world catches a cold. Right. Now, the pandemic has seen a positive change for the Chinese economy. At least they have, been the stronger ones to emerge out of this recession. And though China is the root of the virus, right? So, is it fair to say that China may see to that the phrase includes their name instead of the USA?
So the thing is that China in recent years has been very successful in maintaining their trade relations and political relations separately with so many countries. I will give you a recent example. Recently, it is hard to believe, but recently China has uh, agreed upon a free trade agreement with European Union.
All right.
At the same time, we can see that China has a lot of ideological issues with European nations such as France and Germany. Germany has recently accused China for having a network of spies and doing a continuous espionage in Indian territory. At the same time, they are one of the biggest trade partners with China. So these were the examples of China's success of maintaining political and trade relations separately. In recent times, we have seen that as Shreya mentioned, the Road and Belt Initiative, which was initiated by Xi Jinping in 2012, has been gaining a great response from many countries, and it is fetching great amounts to China's economy. We can say that China has been continuously uh, doing great in terms of trade with many Southeast Asian countries also, although having at the same time great ideological differences between same people.
Mm-hmm.
One more example, rather the best example I would say here, the RCEP deal in itself. By its very nature, the deal is comprising of the countries such as Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, which few months back we were finding in the newspapers they were fighting upon some issues, and today they are part of a world's biggest free trade agreement.
That is right.
And China's policymakers have been very, very successful in maintaining that.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly in recent few years, we can say that US will be replaced by China because the average Chinese person remains far more poor than an average American.
Mm-hmm.
We may expect that in few years, the China may surpass the United States uh, in the terms of their size of economy
Mm-hmm.
there, but the kind of economic development that we have seen in the West might not be seen in China, at least in recent few years. So
Right.
you can say that China will replace US as an economic superpower in next few years, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that will impact the world too much, at least for some time now.
That is right. Perfectly put, Varad. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
May I
thank you.
make a point here?
Surely, Shreya, go ahead.
Yeah, I think also the fact that China isn't looking at the kind of leadership that America exhibited in the yesteryears, because it comes with its own fair share of lacunae, providing education to international students, or even being at the center of global politics.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little too much of, say, fiddly things for China, for that matter. So I
Mm-hmm.
think China is more interested in ensuring that no other country can thwart its global power or the image that it would have created. And then when you combine this piece of information with the recent change in administration that the USA has witnessed
Mm-hmm.
with Biden coming to power, I think it may be a little too premature to make a comment like that.
All right. That is fair. Thank you, Shreya, for that input. Varad, I'll go towards a comment that I had read recently in Indian Express. It was mentioned that monetary policy could not do the heavy lifting to uplift the economies in the world. Like, for example, in USA, the Federal Reserve Bank was providing an interest rate of 0% for loans, at least for corporates, thus leaving no room from where they could take control of the money supply. Right. So now they say that fiscal policy needs to be unconventional and creative to combat the pandemic. Do you think there have been some policies that developed economies like USA have taken in the fiscal arena?
So, as you said, Akash, the monetary policy from the United States have seen a great headwinds in the sense that they already had interest rate at nil, hence
Mhm.
leaving no room for the Federal Reserve to improve further or to take any action in terms of monetary policy. In
Mhm.
terms of fiscal policy, we generally talk about trade-related taxes or the overall taxation system, as well as the economic stimulus. Then we talk about the trade barriers or tariffs which the countries are imposing. So all these things are included in a fiscal policy. So what could government do is that rather than directly jumping on that, I would rather say that recently we have heard in newspapers and all the media outlets as well that US is planning to impose greater taxes on the rich people.
Mhm.
but we must understand to how much extent it will help the government. That is, highly taxing the rich people won't be as beneficial as there are not too many, and that will definitely erode the capital formation in the country in the recent times. It will
Mhm.
definitely in short term improve the government revenues through the taxes, but in long term or in terms of public distribution of country's wealth will be affected. As we're
Right.
talking about a creative fiscal policy, we can expect the government to work in other parts of fiscal policy, that is improving trade relations with other countries. And
Mhm.
similarly, we can see the United States could be more free with the countries such as countries which are part of NATO. NATO is not a trade alliance; it is a military alliance. Although it is a a group of countries which are closely related, which have same ideologies, and we have seen the US president to be in some disputes with those countries as well,
Mhm.
which was certainly unexpected, and which was not an appropriate move, at least in my opinion,
Mhm.
because at the time when the country should be improving the relations with other countries, increasing the trade, which finally stimulates the economic growth in the uh, country. At
Mhm.
that time, we have seen leaders have been doing otherwise. So,
Right.
in terms of fiscal policy, now the government has to be more, creative. And adding to that point, I would like to say that in recent few years, as the economies boost, rather
Mhm.
either due to either the reason may be the discovery of vaccine
Mhm.
or current economic tailwinds, which we all are seeing now.
Mhm.
The interest rates also, which are included in monetary policy, will be improved further. They also might see an uptrend in
Mhm.
coming years. So the governments in next 5 to 6 years will have more choice to swiftly operate between monetary as well as fiscal policy.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Varad. Our next session, which is on Sunday, is on the Brexit, which you're more than welcome to attend. So, moving towards that topic, this question goes to you, Shreya. Now, UK, as we know, is believed to get stronger once it splits from the EU, but has been a strategic trade partner and has many benefits being with the European Union all these years. So the pandemic is now really severe, and the country is seeing a strict lockdown in the current times. So taking this into consideration, will Boris Johnson be able to revive its economy with the Brexit taking place?
So, first of all, taking into account the Brexit deal, I think that Britain got a fair deal out of it. It was just finalized in the past few weeks, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
And Britain got a pretty good deal. UK got a pretty good deal out of it. So they won't be facing any issues uh, on that account or on that in that aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Then we move on and see in terms of a greater recovery, despite the bumbling response under Boris Johnson's administration, we see that the country has already started its inoculation drive. And sure, there is a looming variant that is spreading in major cities in the country, but still, at least as the reports that have been released and made public are to go by, they mostly say that the inoculation drive or the efficacy of the vaccine wouldn't be all that affected or compromised because of this new strain. So, and even if the lockdown was to be extended for a few more periods, for a few more quarters or months, I think the UK economy will be able to stay afloat, largely owing to its great reserves that it has accumulated and also its budget of the past few uh, 5 3 years, because its budget deficit has always been exceptional. So recovery may not be something in the cards for UK in the immediate future, but it's still something it can look towards, or the revival of economy can be worked on while trying to keep the economy afloat during the pandemic, which has taken a severe turn in UK.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Shreya. Now, of course, this session was a little more focused on the 2020 pandemic. We just took the background of 2008 pandemic, but still 2008 recession. But still, we had a good enough comparison happening here. So I thank both our panelists today, Varad as well as Shreya. And all our viewers, please do like this video and share it, subscribe it, and signing off with this session. Thank you so much.